Okay, ladies and gentlemen, moving forward today, what is chapter 7 in your book? We continue with this preliminary overview of the recording book this time. So last time we made an overview analysis of the two very important statistical measures of macroeconomy, two different types of statistics that are widely used in macroeconomic analysis: the unemployment statistics and the price level. This entire week we will be talking about another crucially important macroeconomic measure, which is called gross domestic product, known under the charming abbreviation GDP. That's the main statistical measure that tells us a couple of things at the same time, and we will see this big what it measures, how, and also what are the limitations of this. So we will deal today mostly with the question how, with the question why, what it measures. What is GDP? What is the definition of GDP? And what it does measure and what it does not measure. In other words, what are the limitations? Next two times, we will talk much more about how exactly GDP figures are constructed. That there are different ways of measuring GDP, and also the use of GDP statistics in macroeconomic policy. So on Wednesday and Friday, we will be talking more about that. So today we will begin with this question: what does GDP measure? And we can start with a basic preliminary and very simple answer that measures a couple of things. The first one is business cycle. It's necessary in the analysis of the business cycle. We are completely lost at sea if we don't have a GDP measure. So what is business cycle? I don't remember that. Business cycle.
It's pretty just how like the economy will like go rise, will like go peaking points, but then it'll crash and have recessions, just like that constant motion.
So boom and bust cycle. You have a period of positive economic growth, and then you have it's followed by a period of a negative economic growth, which is called a recession. Recessions and I'd say booms. So now you can see, so that's the definition. The business cycle is a succession of the periods of positive economic growth and the periods of negative economic growth, or aka recessions. The question is, how do we know that the economy is growing or shrinking? If you don't know that, you need the GDP. That's what GDP numbers are for. Another concept you'll see that is defined in the same breath when you say that the GDP statistics is necessary to define whether we are in a recession or not, the economic growth. How we measure whether an economy is growing. It's GDP. So you can say, even before we define GDP, what it is exactly, we can say that economic growth is an increase, is a positive rate of change in GDP. Delta GDP, change in GDP, greater than zero. That's positive economic growth. That's growth. If it's less than 1, less than 0, that means that the economy is shrinking. GDP 2020, 2021 is smaller than GDP in 2020. That means that between 2020 and 2021, there was no economic growth, there was economic decline. As simple as that. That's what we need. GDP figures. And the third measure, which is slightly complicated and will require some qualifications here, is that the GDP statistics of a particular kind give us the information about how wealthy a given country is. So wealth and poverty statistics, wealth and poverty analysis. The GDP tells us that. So we'll come back to this. This will require some additional explaining later on. Just keep it in the back of your mind. Right now there is 3 or 2.5, let's say, because economic growth, the concept of economic growth already explains boom and bust. Boom and bust is just succession of periods of positive economic growth and periods of negative. And we usually define recession. Anyone knows how a recession is officially defined by American government? It's 2 consecutive quarters of negative growth in GDP. That means 6 months. If GDP is declining for 6 months, you're technically officially in recession. So it's not enough. Your GDP might be declining 4 months. That wouldn't qualify as a recession if the economy starts recovering after 6 months. Up to 4 months. Okay, let's now move to the basic definition. What were GDP? The simplest definition is that the GDP is the current market value of all final goods. All final goods and services. This is important. Goods and services produced in a given country or a given territory within a certain period of time, typically a year, maybe less. So the current market value of all final goods and services, with the emphasis on final, and with equal emphasis on goods and services produced on a given territory over a certain period of time. That's the value of final sales of goods and services, all goods and services that are produced. So let's say the American GDP is about $14 trillion. That's the value of everything. We'll see there are some exceptions, not exactly everything that is being paid for as part of GDP, or only the goods and services that are provided to somebody and paid for it, irrespective of who that is. But the government purchases, government payments for goods and services count as part of GDP. What is the unit? Which units GDP is expressed on? Is it miles, kilometers, pounds? What is it? Dollars. So I'll give us a very simple example of I will construct a primitive model consisting of three goods and services. Just demonstrate you what is GDP and how it is. Let's assume that you have three goods economy, A, B, and C. And that you have 20 units of good A, whatever that might be. And that the price per unit is $4. That you have, let's say, 3 units of good B, and the price per unit is $3. And 45 units of this wood C, and the price is $2. So what your GDP in this particular case would be is it's a sum total of all prices and quantities. That would be 20 GDP equals, this is the formula. And I think in our particular case it would be 20 times 4 equals $80 plus 30 times 3, 90 plus 90. 45 times 2. So your GDP here would be $260. These are three final goods or services that are sold in these quantities here. You get the GDP numbers by calculating the final years for every one of them and adding them up. This sigma here means just the sum total. Sigma is a Greek letter for summing up all prices, all revenues, all prices times quantities. One important note here. Always bear in mind this objective here, final. So what is not counted in GDP is the spending on intermediate goods. So 65% of all spending in the economy is one firm purchasing something from another firm and using that as an input in its own production. I'm a baker, I purchase wheat flour from you, and I use it to make a cake or bread. Or I'm a car company, I buy aluminum from an aluminum manufacturing plant and use it to make a car. 65% approximately of all spending is a spending of that kind. But that spending is not counted in GDP. Why is that the case? It's very simple. In order to avoid double counting. Because imagine any production processor making bread. So it starts with wheat. So farmer produces wheat and sells it for $1. A requisite quantity of wheat that is necessary to make a loaf of bread. So then the guy who grinds the wheat pays $1 and then produces flour and sells it for $2. So that's $1 more of additional value. And so on down the line, you have this succession of stages of production during which additional value is created. That is eventually paid, let's say, at $5 is the final price for a loaf of bread. So the final consumer pays essentially for all the costs of production that are involved in producing any given item. So then to count expenditure, so in a sense, when you pay $5 for a loaf of bread, you're paying also for the costs of flour, for the costs of labor, of people who worked on farmland. You're paying for yeast, you're paying for all the components that enter into production costs. So then to count any one of those additional items, those intermediate products separately in GDP would be double count. All of those costs are accounted by the final sale price, the final good. So that's one thing. Intermediate goods are not counted. Only final goods. The second thing here, don't confuse final good with a consumer good. So remember that usually the way how we pair the goods was consumer goods are typically final goods we sell it to the final consumer, and producer goods are goods that are used in the production process that are not the final good, and they cannot be directly consumed. The value of producer goods is derived from the value of consumer goods. Now, here when it comes to GDP, the way how it works is the final good could be a consumer good. You buy bread, you buy a car, you buy all kinds of things that you can directly consume, use to satisfy your consumer needs. That's part of GDP, but also producer goods, or for example, manufacturing equipment or a tractor. When a farmer buys a tractor is not a consumer good. Tractor is used in order to produce consumer goods. Yet, a new sale of a brand new tractor is a part of GDP, because that's the final good. What is the criterion of finality in this definition of GDP is whether that's the end of the road production process. Final customer. So the farmer is the final customer, the final buyer of the completed good. It doesn't matter whether this final good is a consumer good or is it maybe produced. For GDP statistics, that doesn't matter.
Does it count like used goods if you go to like a used car dealership and buy a car?
We'll go to that in a moment. The short answer is no. So GDP doesn't measure second-hand deals. That's one of the limitations, by the way. Because you buy a second-hand car. I buy a second-hand car from you. I'm better off, you're better off. You prefer my money to your car, I prefer your car to my money after a trade has been made, or you and me are better off. Yeah, the GDP statistics doesn't capture these gains from trade because it's a sale of somebody that has already been sold. If you bought a new car, then it's been registered, its value was registered back then, 5 years ago. Now this new sale is not a part of GDP statistics. Only final sale of newly produced goods and services. So it captures producer goods, machinery and equipment, which is sold, consumer goods that are sold, and also services. So you provide a service to somebody, labor service or other service, that counts as GDP. So final goods and services. So you'll see next time when we discuss the calculations of GDP, how people calculate GDP, that one of the ways is actually to add up the incomes. You'll see that the wages, profits, and rents, you add them up, you get GDP. I'll talk about that later. So goods and services, all goods and services sold for the first time to the final customer. Maybe you can use this customer term customer instead of consumer, because consumer implies that you are buying something to use it directly to consume. Customer means a farmer who buys a piece of agricultural machinery or equipment is also customer. So the final goods and services sold to the final customer.
Is rent kind of like leasing?
No, it doesn't say it's. But actually, we'll see later on. You can say indirectly, because renting an apartment, for example, your money that you receive as a rent is counted as a part of GDP. So that's the definition. Next thing. Larger GDP larger the economy. In general. So then you might think larger the GDP is, wealthier the country should be. It's a larger economy, produces more goods and services with higher spending and so on. Is that correct? You know which country has the largest GDP in the world right now?
China.
China. Which country is second, close second? United States. Now, does that mean that China is a wealthier country than the United States? It's a larger GDP after all. China has probably 100 times a larger GDP than Luxembourg or Norway. These are two wealthiest countries in the world. How come? What is the reason for that?
Is it because China has a bigger
Population. So then, this is the complication or additional qualification that I talked about at the beginning, where you use GDP as a measure of wealth and poverty. It's not enough GDP, you need something called GDP per capita. I had to use the one. Per capita means per head or per person. That means GDP divided by population. Essentially, the United States and China have comparable GDPs, but China has 4 times more people. The American economy is 4 to 5 times more productive than Chinese. And America is 4 to 5 times, depending on how we adjust it. Well, it doesn't matter that the GDP of Luxembourg is very small because its population is very small. Because the ratio of GDP to population is much better in Luxembourg than in China. See, there are some further complications. Even this is not enough, because if you have inflation, high rate of inflation in one country and you have zero inflation in another, you have then to adjust the income in a country that experienced inflation to make it apples to apples comparison. That's a real GDP. It's another concept that we will talk about on Friday. That's the GDP per capita or GDP, doesn't matter, adjusted for inflation. We'll see how it goes. Notice one more similarity here between GDP calculations and CPI calculations, consumer price index. You remember, when you construct a price index, you are constructing an average. It doesn't matter which particular item in your representative basket of goods contributes to an increase in CPI. What counts is the total amount of spending that you need to buy a representative basket of goods. Now, depending on the structure of your expenditure, then some items might influence the index more, some items might influence the index less. So then the variations in the price of a good that comprises larger percentage of your total spending will influence consumer price index more. For example, if you spend 40% of your money on energy, gasoline, or whatever, and the price increases 5%, it's going to affect CPI much more than the equivalent change in price in some item that comprises 5%. So something similar applies here. Depending on the structure of your GDP, it could be more or less sensitive to the changes in productivity or in prices associated with one group. So one example that would be oil-rich countries like Russia or Saudi Arabia. So they're heavily dependent. Their GDP is heavily dependent on oil prices. When the oil prices go down, their GDP will decline much more proportionately as compared to, for example, more diversified countries like America. So something similar as in financial portfolio theory that you have. You're exposed to risk much more if you put larger part of your equity in just one type of stocks. Put all proverbial eggs into one basket. So this is similar to the level of macroeconomics. You're putting all your baskets in one egg, It's difficult. It will require simple also. All of your eggs into one basket, and then if something happens to this one particular commodity, then the value of the entire stock, the value of GDP goes down, the price of oil declines. That's what happened in Russia. Calamitous recession in 2008, and the price of oil went down from 150 to 35. There's actually a nice, I don't know what it is, photoshopping. The top image is Vladimir Putin riding a bear, and it says Brent $100. That's the first image, and he's riding a bear across the river, and bear is very nice, and he follows the command. And then the next image, Brent $25. Vladimir Putin swimming and trying to run away from an angry bear representing Russian people. So when the price of oil is very high, everything is hunky-dory because the Russian economy so disproportionately depends on oil. When the price of oil is very bad, they cannot pay, literally they cannot pay social security checks. Their budget is like 60% of Russian federal budget is oil revenue. So you see, GDPs of certain countries, depending on the structure of your economy, might be more exposed to external shocks if you rely disproportionately on one particular commodity or one particular product. Okay, any questions as well? Okay. Now, what GDP does not measure? So we've seen what it does measure. Now let's see what are some of the limitations of GDP statistics. The first thing that we already discussed is the second-hand deals. I don't need to repeat that, so you understand that. When you make a second-hand deal of any kind, you purchase a thrift store or whatever, that transaction is not, or the value that is being exchanged is not registered in GDP statistics. So you can say then that the GDP statistics underestimates the real economic wealth of a given country on multiple accounts or on multiple grounds. One of them is that it doesn't count second-hand deals. They're significant in every country. The second source of underestimation, let's say, is black markets. If I sell you something which is illegal and you like it, I like to sell it, I like the money that I receive, you like the product, whatever that might be. I don't want to give anyone any ideas here, but whatever that might be. If the government prohibits something that people want to buy, prohibition was a good example. Some other substances nowadays, a good example. Then you have a black market that people do whatever they would have been doing otherwise, but it's just the outside of the official channels, so it's not counted in GDP. But still, people benefit from that.
Well, land and houses, because land and houses are like technically secondhand. You know, when you sell them, like you've already used them or bought them.
We'll see on Wednesday how is that calculated, how the property is calculated. That goes to the issue of the calculation of GDP. So they're mostly included. So the problem with the black market is actually that you don't register a significant part of the economy. Depending on the size of the black market, this underestimate would be larger or smaller. So even in the very well-run countries like North American countries or Scandinavian countries like Denmark or Sweden or Norway, there are a certain percentage, there are different estimates, a certain percentage of total economic activities. So indirect ways to estimate the size of this, to estimate the size of the employment market. More corrupt the country is, and worse a country is run, greater the underestimate of this account is. Because in Russia, Russian official GDP figures and Serbian official GDP figures underestimate the Serbian GDP and Russian GDP much more than the American official figures underestimate it. Because the size of the black market in Russia and Serbia is much greater than the size of the black market in the United States. Because of corruption, because of dysfunctional government and regulations, and so on, people do the illegal stuff much more than in well-run countries. So then the official you have to be, that's another thing that another limitation you have to worry about, you have to adjust the official GDP statistics for the size of the black market. To give you one example, in the 1990s, in Serbia, something like 80 to 90% of the total economy was the black market. You would be buying like cooking oil, bread, milk, gasoline, illegal goods on the street. So the street and the guys with 3 or 4 large plastic cans selling gasoline and diesel, and you then give your empty bottle from mineral water or whatever, 2 liters of, can you pour 2 liters of gasoline? 2 liters of gasoline. You pour it in your car from a plastic bottle. There's no tax being paid, there's no interest. Smuggling business that covers 80% to 90% of demand for goods and services. And now if you look at the official Serbian GDP statistics in 1990, the only conclusion that you conceivably could have made is actually those people are already dead, because you cannot live on whatever the official statistics said that income of the country about. But we survived somehow because 90% of what we were consuming were bought on the free markets and illegal markets of different kinds. You would be buying, like you have a flea market in which people sell, like a garage sale. They're selling everything that you need, like hammers and nails and Black & Decker products, and then cooking oil. And clothes and everything. So open, like a gigantic open space. There was one in Belgrade, maybe I find it for you, an image, 20 hectares, basically people selling everything. So then the GDP statistics is not very useful if you're talking about a country like that. Unfortunately, they didn't last forever. Since 2000, Serbia is by and large semi-normal country. We are well past that stage, but still, if you have 20% of your 25% of your total economy in the black market, as we still have, Serbia still has, GDP figures are slightly less informative than in the case of Norway or Sweden. One more thing. One more source of underestimate. So GDP is a quantitative measure. It's statistics. It measures how many units, what is the price. It doesn't tell you anything about the quality. So how would you compare the quality of a car in 2021 and a car in 1983? Or even more pertinently, how would you compare the quality of a typical cell phone in 2021 and its equivalent in 2001, when I got my first cell phone? So this big brick, and send some messages, not too many of them because they were extremely expensive, and you can make calls. That was everything. And if somebody told me that in 10 years or 15 years you would be able to use it as a computer, to play chess on it, to navigate your satellite in an unknown country, GPRS, all kinds of other things that I wouldn't be able to master, like 5 to 10% of these capabilities. How do you compare these two things? In official statistics, this is a cell phone, and that was the cell phone. And obviously, they're not quite the same products. So it's also another source of underestimation of economic wealth. So we're not just better off because we make more cell phones right now, or their price decreased in the meantime. Which all happened, but also these are much better products, and it's impossible to account for an increase in quality by looking just at the GDP, measures. Honda Accord 2020 is a better car than any car anywhere in the world that existed in 1995. There's no doubt. So how then you compare we have more cars now, that's good, but not only that we have more cars, but those cars are order of magnitude better ones than the previous ones. And let alone new products now that didn't exist. In 1965, there is GDP for 1965, but there are no cell phones then. That's another difficulty in calculating GDP, as well as the limitation of GDP. But these are the limitations that we like, actually. As the GDP increases, but we know that it underestimates that we are doing even better off, that we are doing even better than GDP statistics suggest. Now, there are limitations as well that are not so funny, not so nice, that actually overestimate economic welfare associated with GDP. One of the major ones is the so-called problem of externality or economic bets. That means we have $14 trillion worth of GDP in America. And yet if we assume that we are making $1 trillion per year of, let's say, environmental costs, environmental damages, that are not solved, that are not eliminated, then the real value of everything that we produce will be 13 trillion rather than 4. Whatever, let's say CO2 emissions into the atmosphere create a global, what is it called, the greenhouse effect that creates global warming, that creates all kinds of climatic climate havoc that will have negative economic effects in the future. So this is the concept of externality, that we produce costs in society that we don't pay for. So then our GDP figures would be the overestimates of the real economic value that we produce, because there are some costs that we created but we didn't pay for. That's a huge problem, huge topic here. Another distinction, I wouldn't say that this is a limitation, GDP, but a useful distinction to bear in mind. That there is GDP, and then there is something called GNP, gross national product. So this is GDP is a gross domestic product, GNP is a gross national product. So what is the difference? The difference is that GDP is economic value produced by the residents of a given country. So in America, everybody who lives in the United States and works and produces anything contributes to the American GDP, irrespective of whether you are an American citizen or not. So the country of citizenship doesn't matter for GDP. What matters is the residence. So I'm a Canadian citizen. I work in the United States. My salary and every income that I make goes towards American GDP. Okay, so that's the income product made by the residents. GNP is a product made by the citizens, all Americans. What all Americans produce, irrespective of the country of residence. So Americans who work in Norway or in whatever, Germany or Japan, the value that they create contributes to American GNP, American gross national product. So GDP is not the same thing as GNP. one question for you. Let's take a country like Mexico. What do you think? Which is greater, Mexican GDP or Mexican GDP?
GDP,
Why?
because of all the workers they export.
Okay. Oh, why would that lead to higher GDP than GDP?
Because they're not producing it inside Mexico.
They're not producing as much. Where?
At home.
At home. So what is the main country of immigration to Mexico? Largest number here. So whatever they produce, the wages for the same jobs in the United States are 5 to 6 to 10 times higher. I don't know what's the exact relationship than in Mexico. So the GNP, when you add up all the incomes created by Mexicans who live everywhere in the world, is certainly far higher than GDP, domestically produced income, because of a large number of Mexicans who live in the United States. So you have the same effect actually for my home country, for Serbia. Actually, Serbian GNP is vastly greater than Serbian GDP because almost 1 million Serbs live in countries like Germany, France, Sweden, United States, Canada, and so on. So they earn much more there than the home country. So then countries that have a large immigration in wealthier countries can afford to have a higher standard of living than their GDP would allow. So people who work in Germany send money back to Serbia to their parents, relatives, and so on. So additional cash inflow, that additional money, wealth that is being created in Germany but spent in Serbia. The same applies for Mexican and other immigrants to the United States from poorer countries who send money back to their relatives. So that's money being created in America spent in Mexico. So that's one aspect of maybe one difference actually, that the GDP figures, not only that poor countries, the GDP, the real economic wealth of poor countries is underestimated because of the larger size of their black market, but also because they typically have a larger immigration that sends money home, so that people can live on a slightly higher level, with a slightly higher standard of living than their GDP is showing. What about the United States? What do you think? What is larger, GNP or GDP? I don't know the answer. I haven't looked, but just speculate now. What do you think? What should be the case? What is the structure of American immigration? It's not very likely to be people who are seeking better economic opportunities because they cannot make it here. It's not very likely. There may be 4 or 5 countries with higher GDP per capita in the world. The United States. That's probably not likely. What is more likely is actually that people for fun. I just read a few weeks ago an article in Serbian newspapers about the American community in Belgrade, Serbia. People mostly from New York City and the states that were locked down hard could make fun in the United States. And they realized, well, geez, this Belgrade seems like a nice city. Everything is dirt cheap, $300 in a new apartment downtown. Everybody speaks English. Bars and restaurants work full speed ahead, no restrictions whatsoever. Having fun, enjoying. I can work online via Zoom. Why does it matter whether I sit in New York or in Belgrade? So there's dozens, maybe hundreds of people, not Americans of Serbian ancestry who are now coming back. That doesn't happen. Americans, people who never been to Serbia, they're now moving there, and in some other countries. So you see then, what will change with respect to their income? It's not very clear. Maybe not. They can work in Serbia the same job that they used to work in America. It may not have any effect on American GDP or the relationship between GDP. Okay.
Is there anything else?
No. Next time, just to give you the sense what remains. What remains are 3 things. methods of calculation of GDP. We will start that on Wednesday. So there's spending approach and income approach or method of calculating GDP, and then real versus nominal GDP and adjusted determination. So that's everything that remains for the next 2 sessions. Okay, see you all on Wednesday.